My neighbor thought a fresh coat of paint on his perfect life included erasing mine, so he sicked code enforcement on my porch. He didn't expect the inspector to open the book, find one quiet clause with my father's handwriting in the margins, and watch everything flip. You're watching Revenge Files. Subscribe for a new twist daily. I live in Lincolnville, the old heart of St. Augustine, where porches lean like old men telling stories and oak branches lace over streets the color of tea. My bungalow is cedar and stubborn and smells like pine soap after rain. The front porch sits a bit deeper than the new setback requires, and the workshop out back, a simple cinder block box with a tin roof, hums with hand tools and a radio that only ever finds the blues. My father built the shop with neighbors, cigarettes tucked behind ears, back when the city was quieter and codes were sketched with thicker pencils. He taught me to true a board by ear. The blade sings clean when it's right. I taught shop at the high school for a spell, and then started restoring small wooden skiffs. The rhythm suits me. Glue, clamp, plane, sand, repeat, like praying with your hands. Colin Everett moved in across the street after a flip that turned a lanky one-story into a white cube with glass that watched itself. He wore boat shoes that didn't know docks and a shirt that always looked slightly newer than the day before. He told me, the first week, that he was all about neighborhood standards. He pointed at my porch swing, at the skiff on the trailer, at the utilities wall on the side where I'd hung my father's copper hose reel. He said he loved old Florida charm, so long as it didn't impact property values. He smiled when he did it. That was the part that made me feel the way a nail feels just before the hammer lands. The complaints started quiet, an anonymous note typed on a printer that believed in crisp edges. Then a glare when I planed a keel after breakfast. He put up a fence tall enough to argue with the sky. He hosted an open house that smelled like citrus cleaner and told prospective buyers, loudly, how peaceful the street was except for one project house. A week later, a yellow door hanger blinked at me when I came home from the marina. City of St. Augustine Code Enforcement. Possible violations: accessory structure setbacks, porch guardrail height, outdoor storage. Someone had reported me. The notice was polite in the way of people wearing gloves. I walked the backyard with the paper and the dog-eared notebook where I keep my estimates. The live oak brushed my shoulder like an ant. The workshop sat exactly where it had always sat, a few feet closer to the fence than the code now allowed. The porch had its original rail, still stout, still lower than the newer rules. None of it was dangerous, none of it felt wrong. But feelings don't show up in the ordinance. My father used to say, you can be right and still lose if you don't bring the right evidence. He said it over the kitchen table with rolled plans under his elbow, the night he wrote a letter to the city when the zoning changed. His letter was why I didn't panic. I went to the shed that still smelled like summer and swallows and pulled the cigar box from the rafters. It had an old barber's advert pasted crooked on the lid and a rubber band fossilized around the middle. Inside were scraps of code language clipped from the paper, Polaroids of the porch with my mother's geraniums and coffee cans, and a thin carbon copy of a permit receipt folded like a bird. The letter was there, thin onion skin with his square handwriting. He'd written to the planning department after a code revision, asking whether the existing porch and the new workshop would be considered legal nonconforming under the city's grandfather clause. The stamped answer said yes. The city had even highlighted the paragraph with a yellow marker that had bled into the fibers. The date on his letter was clear as a day, July 12, 1981. I took photos of those papers and sent a public records request to the city clerk for my property file and for any permits pulled on Collins Place. Florida is a sunshine state in more than one way. Paperwork blooms here if you know where to look. The clerk, kind as a librarian, emailed me scans, old appraiser cards, aerial photos showing my outbuilding like a stubby thumb decades ago, and a list of inspections. I printed everything. I set them in a stack like a sandwich you feed a judge. The inspection came on a morning with gulls overhead and heat already seeping under the eaves. Inspector Lourdes Vega stepped out of a city Prius with a clipboard and a patience that looked worn but sturdy. She shook my hand like we were about to play a fair game. Before we walked the property, she asked the usual questions. Did I expand the shop? No. Had I raised the porch, built a deck, poured a new slab? No. She asked if I knew who reported me. I said I had a guess, and she looked across the street just as Colin came out with a coffee and a camera peeking around his hip like a pet. He tried to join us, neighborly as a hawk. He told Lurd he was concerned about neighborhood compliance. He used phrases like sightline and hazard and nonconforming in the way people use new words when they still taste the dictionary on them. Lurd listened, wrote nothing, and then we walked. At the workshop, she measured from the fence, looked at the aerial prints I'd brought, flipped through the stamped response from planning. At the porch, she tapped a baluster and said, "Still solid." She read my father's letter, the stamp, the underlined paragraph he'd noted in blue pencil. She took a photo of the permit receipt that showed a fee of $42 and made a small sound like a lock opening. Colin hovered by the sidewalk, filming, narrating for no one. He asked whether she'd cite me for the porch height. Lord took a breath and read the clause aloud. The one that says if a structure was lawful when built and sits where it sat before the change, it may remain as a legal nonconforming use so long as it isn't expanded in a way that increases the nonconformity. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't have to be. When she reached the part about how a grandfathered structure becomes a historic resource if it contributes to the character of the district, his mouth adjusted like he'd bitten a pepper. He blamed loopholes. Lord smiled like someone who has been called a loophole before and kept going. She noted my compliance. She told me she'd recommend my case be closed with no action. Then she rested her palm on the porch column and asked, very calmly, whether my neighbor had pulled a permit for the rooftop deck she could see winking behind his parapet. Colin said, of course, that everything he did was above board. She asked him to bring out his permit. He fetched a sheet from a kitchen drawer, an over-the-counter permit for a small balcony, not a deck, with a note requiring guardrails and wind load calculations and a final inspection. No final inspection was listed. Lurd looked at the deck again. It spread wider than a balcony, and it crowded the setback like a boat too big for its slip. She walked toward his property line, stopped to look back at mine, and then told him she needed access to verify measurements. He hesitated and then opened his gate. I stayed on my side and watched the dance. She measured, checked her book, compared the drawing to what existed, and started writing. Her pen did not pause, and his voice did not land anywhere useful. When she finished, she handed him a notice of violation with a compliance date. She told him the addition appeared to have expanded a previously non-conforming side yard condition, and that expansion voided the protection he thought he had. She said he might need to remove the deck or reduce it. She also asked about the garage conversion, which had a split unit humming and blackout curtains at noon. He said it was a media room. She nodded like she had heard the word media before. The next door post started that afternoon. He called my shop a safety hazard and suggested I play the system. He said the neighborhood deserved quiet real estate. I said nothing online. I fixed a loose hinge and bought pastries for the men at the city records window. My father always said, "You don't argue with a microphone. You bring documents to a table." I brought documents. I printed the aerial timeline again, where you could watch my shop flicker along the years like a patient heartbeat. I printed the survey from the 80s that pinned the rear corner of the workshop with a little triangle and initials in a draftsman's careful hand. I laid them flat under a clean plastic sleeve. A week later, I got a letter closing my case. Colin got a door tag, then another, then a hearing notice. He paced his lawn talking into his phone like the lawn had authority. He grumbled about tourist dollars and neighborhood standards. He threw a glance at my porch every time he passed. He filmed me hauling cedar and posted a clip with a caption about unpermitted construction, which was silly, given that I was hauling old boards to the curb on pickup day. My friends told me to sue. I imagined the hours in a courtroom, and the taste of it felt like metal. I don't like courtrooms unless a city seal is attached to the invitation. The morning of his hearing, I walked downtown to the old city hall where the walls smell like salt and paper. The Code Enforcement Board meets in a room that looks like a miniature courtroom, with a flag that has watched trouble before and nameplates for the volunteers who try to keep neighbors from chewing each other. Lurd was there with a neat file. Colin arrived with a man whose suit had not seen sweat. They carried a binder thick with photographs of my porch, my truck, the skiff on the trailer. I wasn't on the docket, but I sat down anyway. When my father died, my mother told me, "When you are part of a story, you show up for the last chapter." The city presented first. Lurd described the permit that had been pulled, the balcony that turned into a deck, the lack of final inspection, the encroachment into the side setback, and the expansion of a non-conforming condition. Then she added a line that was new to me. "The garage," she said, appeared to function as short-term lodging, which is not permitted by right in this zoning district without a special exception. She'd noticed the signage on a booking site, screenshots included. Her tone never sharpened. It didn't need to. The photos were tidy and damning. Colin's attorney tried to paint the deck as a clarification, argued that the inspector had misread the setbacks, and suggested my porch was the true issue, a blight that reduced his property value. He asked to introduce photos, my porch in harsh noon light, my shop with the door open and clamps hanging like ribs. The board chair told him those were irrelevant to his case. The man pressed, and the chair leaned forward with a patience that had chairs behind it. The chair asked Lured whether the porch was under enforcement. She said no, and she repeated the clause's language in the plain way she had on my steps. The twist came courtesy of my father's stubbornness. The board asked for the original file on my property to verify the timeline of the nonconformity and whether any changes had triggered a loss of status. Lured opened a different folder and held up the onion skin with the city stamp and my father's note underlining the language. She explained for the record that legal nonconforming status transfers with the property so long as the structure isn't expanded in a way that increases the nonconformity. Then she turned to Colin's plans again and pointed to a drawing from a previous owner's approval, an allowance for a small balcony granted years ago with the warning that any expansion would forfeit protection and require full compliance. It was the same clause, looking out from a different page. The small balcony had become a broad party deck, the kind that laughs at wind codes. According to the city, the moment he extended it, he stepped off the grandfathered path and onto the regular one. The board members looked at one another the way fishermen look at a sky that's already decided. They voted to uphold the violations. He was given time to correct them and a fine that would start small and grow if he didn't. There was also a separate citation, specific and blunt, for the unpermitted lodging in the garage, $500 that day, with the threat of more if he ignored the notice. He stood there while the numbers sat in the air like rivets he couldn't pry out. He kept glancing back at me as if to see whether I'd gloat. I didn't. I looked at my hands and traced the ladder of scars that say I know what work feels like. You'd think that would be the end, but people are complicated machines. He tried to make nice for a stretch, waving in a way that couldn't afford sincerity. Then he snapped back, blasting a leaf blower at dawn, dragging garbage cans to the curb like he hoped they'd dent. I stayed steady. I moved my planing schedule later, not because I had to, but because my mother taught me that courtesy is cheaper than a fight. I planted more jasmine along the fence. I took on an extra skiff from a local guide who paid in cash and stories. I was tired of thinking about the man across the street, but I also kept a folder labeled with his last name because I am my father's son. The city came by again when the compliance deadline lapped. The deck still sat wide and arrogant. The garage still looked like a tiny hotel room. He'd hired a contractor to write a report full of words like variance and hardship. The report included a sentence about neighborhood compatibility, and that one made me laugh. Lincolnville knows more about compatibility than reports do. The inspector posted another notice. The fines ticked in the background like a clock you only hear at night. He listed his house, pulled it down, listed it again with photos that cropped out the deck, and called the garage a flex space. The market didn't flex the way he needed. His agent told him, loud enough for the air to hear, that buyers in this town read public records. The deck came down in sections one hot afternoon, boards tossed in a pile that looked like a lost argument. The garage grew quiet without the hum of the little unit. He put the house back on the market with cheerful adjectives that felt like makeup on a bruise. He got an offer later, but it wasn't the number he'd bragged about on his porch. A notary came and went. A moving truck nested by his curb like a temporary bird. He left with a last look over his shoulder that held less anger than something like disbelief. The week after he moved, a woman in her 60s with hair the color of magnolia bark introduced herself as the new owner. She worked at Flagler College and kept bees. She brought honey to the first block gathering of the season, a jar stamped with a label that said harvested nearby. She liked my porch. She asked if the swing creaked, and I said only when it's about to rain. We stood there, both of us listening to the soft complaints of rope and wood, the comfortable kind. It took time for the quiet to feel like quiet again. I stopped walking to the window when a car door slammed. I stopped waiting for a letter on the door. I took my father's letter out one more time and read the paragraph that had steadied us both. He never wrote like a poet, But underneath the city stamp, he'd penciled a line. Keep records. Keep neighbors when you can. Keep your word. I tucked it back, then made a copy and framed it near the shop door where I hang the square. I'm not sentimental about papers. I am sentimental about proof. Neighbors asked me if I felt vindicated, and I told them the truth. I felt tired, then relieved, then grateful in a practical way that doesn't need capital letters. The revenge, if that's what it was, didn't come with fireworks. It came with a clause written long before the argument, with a city that still believes in stamps and hearings and patient inspectors who will climb a ladder if they need to. It came with me deciding not to throw gas on a fire and instead bring kindling to a bench where people still talk. Some nights, when the light turns that soft Florida honey and the river sighs in the distance, I'll sand a thwart until the grain wakes. The porch sits where it has always sat, a little stubborn, a little proud. The swing carries a hum inside it like a remembered song. If you stand there long enough, you can hear the neighborhood breathe, the murmur of a basketball on a driveway, a bicycle chain, the clack of someone closing a book. I know my place on this block. It's not a fortress or a flag. It's a threshold someone built carefully and then defended with paper and patience. I think about my father more now, not as the foreman of my childhood, but as a man who understood how time works on wood and on people. He knew you can't force a board straight. You steam it, coax it, clamp it, let it cool the way it wants. He couldn't have known a neighbor in boat shoes would try to rearrange our life decades later. But he knew enough to write to the right office and to keep that letter in a cigar box. That was his version of the future, a small safeguard tucked in against whatever weather might come. What I want to say, if there's a moral braided into the grain, is that not every fight needs a hammer. Sometimes the best swing is the slow one at the beginning. The record you request, the photo you file, the clause you underline for a day that hasn't arrived. And sometimes revenge looks like a city seal pressed into paper while the man who started it realizes that the rules he tried to weaponize are the same rules that ask him to put the boards back where they belong.